one of the things that certainly what we have been focused on dealing with in the last several months is purely, to my mind, in terms of survival. And it is certainly has come as a shock to, I think, to all of us on how quickly things have changed. Just to give an example here is that if you look back to what was going on in December 2019, is that you will see that the US, these are US numbers, not global figures, is that the United States has had the longest string of growth in its history entirely. And you'll notice how that graph, certainly from 2005, has certainly illustrated that the unemployment rate in December 2019 was 3.5%, and which for the United States is actually what would normally be considered actually too low of an unemployment rate. There was questions about whether this could even be sustainable without tying in inflation, but it turns out it had been. And now again, that you'll notice in terms of what happened with the unemployment rate in the United States, again, going back from 2005 to now, and that where it certainly has been on a fairly steady decline since about 2009. And then obviously starting around March or so of this year, it's gone up dramatically. The projected GDP growth for the United States was between 2 and 3%. And the estimate that just came out yesterday is that the United States will be lucky if there will be a decline in GDP of 4.1%. So again, obviously, the trend lines have been broken. Something qualitatively has really changed. And the question about it is that how are we going to be dealing with this as individuals? How we're going to be dealing with as business organizations, and how we're going to be dealing with this in terms of government and non-government organizations. For those of you who have been around for a little while, this may illustrate the kind of feelings that what you have. I'm 61, and so I've survived all these things. And as the old man in the picture is showing, it says, I survived sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, just to die from an unprotected handshake in 2020. And, you know, there is this, wait, I survived all this potentially threatening things, and all I have to do is accidentally say hello to the wrong person, and lo and behold, you know, a disaster can happen. So I think that it is, you know, critical to realize that many things have changed, but in the case, many things have not. And that one of the things I think certainly that Dr. Ruda spoke of also, I want to elaborate on a little bit in a little bit more detailed circumstances in regards to businesses specifically, is that there are some things, of course, that had to be done immediately and still need to be done immediately. Such things as how do we keep safe, both in terms of individuals and how to be keeping our employees safe. And, oh, by the way, in business. So there may be some immediate cash flow problems that frankly would permanently close a lot of organizations. And unfortunately, this has been the case. I mean, just to give a very direct example is that there is a laundry place, a dry cleaning place that is just up the road from me a couple of kilometers. And I was talking to the owner just 3 weeks ago, and he knew that he was in trouble, and I was trying to help him out to let him know about what various government programs were to help him. And I came by there 3 days ago, and not only was the business closed, the machinery inside was gone. And so he went from a reasonably successful business to total collapse inside 3 weeks. And this is circumstances that a number of organizations, both small and large, are certainly are facing. In the shorter term kind of things, we're looking really more in terms of stabilization. And this is going back a little bit again to what Dr. Ruda was saying. And then in the short term is that how do we do things like stabilize our cash flow? You know, what happens that if our customers are no longer there, or they're asking for forgiveness in terms of their payments, or asking for delays in terms of their mortgages to be paid? You know, how do we deal with that in terms of a cash flow situation? Secondly, is that how do we stabilize our resources? It's that not only that my business may be affected, but our subcontractors may be affected, our vendors may be affected. And to be frank about it, we may actually have to look in terms of what kind of support mechanisms as a company needs to really be done to be helping our vendors. Otherwise, we may not really have anything to go back to once business starts to recover. Thirdly, we also need to talk about in general about supply chain. is that certainly this has illustrated not only the various political tensions that have happened between China and the United States, but also in terms of supply chains in regards to critical infrastructure and critical supplies, anywhere from biotechnology to masks, to critical things that, to be frank about it, if business were disrupted, we might not have easy access to. So this in and of itself may require you to be changing the supply chains, even in the short term, to be successful in terms of what you want to be doing. Fourthly, is that what kind of customers you might actually want to have. Curiously enough, there is a large biomedical company who's, I'll let remain nameless, was at a presentation of his by the CEO. And they were able to change who their customers were and change what products they were producing almost on a dime, so very, very quickly. But the reason they could do that is because they had very good customer-supplier relationships. So they were able to pivot, if you will, into a very different kind of business model, so that one particular product that was perhaps only 15 or 20% of their production actually turned into 56% of their production. Lastly, not leastly, in the short term and in the long term, you need to be dealing with new regulations. And that is, for example, if you are a restaurant, that you have to have social distancing, you have to have at least 6 feet or 2 meters apart from each individual. What kind of safety precautions do you have to be putting in for your employees? All those kind of concerns and so on have to be dealt with as well. You may have to be, if you are a gym, or that if you are some other kind of manufacturing kind of company, all of a sudden you have to be maybe changing completely your assembly line, because everyone previously was standing side by side and having easy access to the tools and equipment that they need. But unfortunately, gives them much greater exposure to whatever kind of viruses or other contagions are going around. So you may actually have them be required to be rejiggering your assembly line accordingly. And actually, a number of companies are also doing that kind of work. Lastly and leastly is that you're talking about the intermediate term. And that is that what kind of things are you going to have to be dealing with to survive and to grow in the long run? And this really is going to be the focus of our presentation here. That is what we would call the intermediate kind of things. That is, you've passed the survival phase, you've made at least some short-term kind of adjustments to what you have to do, but now you have to begin to be looking at the longer term. And part of that particular kind of thing is what we deal with and what we have done with our particular kind of situation, what are called scenarios. And we have used these kind of scenarios in this process in a number of our clients, and that they have found it to be useful in planning contingencies as to what actually might happen. So in regards to scenarios, what do we mean by scenarios? Well, scenarios, what they use potential futures to take into account global, regional, industry, and organizational trends. Now, mind you, they are not the trends themselves. These are possibilities about how those trends might interact. They use factors to develop alternatives to what might happen. And they use signposts and indicators to give a heads up that a scenario may come about. And these are very important separate things that you need to keep in mind when you start talking about scenarios. Because very often what happens is, and I'm sorry to say it's an unfortunate kind of a thing, is that many companies, what they have done is they have assumed that the future will be like the past. And as what we certainly have found out in the last several months, that definitely is not true. They may have taken time to develop a vision for the company, but again, the vision for the company is based upon what they think the future is going to be and the certainty that the future may become. And that's not a good assumption to make nowadays. Scenarios also allow for unexpected events rather than just looking at trends. I've seen many times where organizations have looked at trends, both in terms of demographic and economic trends, without really looking at what kind of qualitative changes may be happening in the short term and the long term. And that is really a deficiency in terms of when they go through strategic planning. Thirdly, is the scenarios allow for flexibility in planning. And that is that not to be so rigid, to have one clear purpose, one clear direction, but not realize that there may be things that are barriers along the way that are going to be stopping you. Scenarios also are adjustable depending upon when new data or opportunities come about. So in other words, these scenarios themselves are not necessarily rigid and inflexible, but may be adjusted and changed depending upon what signposts and indicators you have. Lastly and leastly is that scenarios are an excellent starting point for strategic planning. And that this is the interesting part really about this entire use of scenarios and the like, is that many organizations use scenarios. Many organizations use strategic planning, but not that many organizations actually use both to become a fully flexible organization to be accomplishing what they need to do. Some of the factors affecting scenarios include things like political issues, social demographic issues, technological issues, competitive and disruptive business models, and the degree and pace of change. Oops, sorry, back up. And so in this particular case, you really are talking about some of the major factors that have to be affecting your scenarios. When we develop scenarios for our clients, these are not necessarily the large global kind of factors that need to be taken into account. There may be very local and very company specific things that may also need to be brought into here. But these are the major particular factors in terms of that may be influencing your scenarios and what we use to develop scenarios for our various clients. What you see here is what we call a scenario matrix. And that is that you can imagine that when we work with our clients, we may be coming up with several different scenarios. And there may be, in this particular case, various geopolitical, political, economic, social issues, and organizational issues that may come about. And then based upon that, there may be examples, stories, and paragraph summaries based upon all of these particular kind of scenarios. In many of the cases when we've used this process with our clients, some of the scenarios have been the future is like the past. There's been a modestly positive future, a modestly negative future, and a series of very negative particular kind of futures here. And that when you start looking at things this way, you realize is that the future isn't what it used to be, to use an old phrase, and that things may change very rapidly. But that if you have a heads up using scenarios, you'll be able to start changing your organization appropriately before the events actually occur. In these particular kind of cases here, some of the factors involved when we work with our Middle East clients is that we have dealt with such things as if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, other kind of circumstances where the price of oil has crashed and rebounded, which to some extent it has. And thirdly, other kind of factors such as social unrest. And curiously enough, what happened when we were working with one of our clients in the Middle East, that just then, there turns out there actually was a protest that was going on by a subset of the population. And so it really provided very good context and a reminder about those different kind of social things that can actually occur. In the case of another particular client, Sony, that is the games people at Sony, that two of the factors involve what are called net neutrality and also the degree of localization in terms of their own game development. So we developed 4 scenarios for them based upon that in terms of how much work they were going to be doing inside the company, how much they're going to be outsourcing, and on whether the information across the internet will be flow independently of who you are, or whether the net will no longer be neutral, unquote. So when we worked with our clients, it's actually been in terms of customizing things according to what their own particular needs might be. In regards to the economy, which I know so many people here are concerned with, as am I, is there have been various scenarios in regards to economic recovery. And these right here are half a dozen of them. This is coming from the Wall Street Journal as possible opportunities and issues concerning to be in the next several years. What some politicians are hoping for is that the economy's recovery will be V-shaped. That is that it basically will be popping down drastically and then popping up very rapidly and go on to where it is, what it would have been, I'm sorry. Other kind of alternatives exist, such as the U-shaped recovery, the swish-shaped recovery, a Z-shaped recovery, where things decline, go up, and go back down again, because coronavirus has resurfaced, More of a W kind of situation, in essence, is where it's gone down and then up and then down and then finally recovering. And in the worst particular kind of shape, what we would call an L-shaped recovery. And that is that where things have declined and it never fully recovers to what it actually was going to be. The estimates, at least some of the estimates now, just to give you an example, is that the forecast that the Federal Reserve came out for the unemployment rate in the fourth quarter for this year is 9.5%. And that certainly is not what I would be calling a V-shaped recovery. Guesses are that things will maybe be recovering to what they were, probably in about 2023. So from a personal perspective, I don't anticipate any significant kind of change. When you're dealing with these particular kind of scenarios, is that, to my mind, you need to be looking at things in terms of what we call a 2x2 matrix, developed based upon the severity of the problem and the extent of the problem. Because it very well may be that when you start working with these scenarios and start developing strategies, that you're going to be noticing differences between where you are and where you need to be. And those two things can actually change depending upon scenario to scenario. So in other words, what can happen is that in one scenario, you don't need to change much. With another particular scenario comes about, you do. And so one way of looking at this is to be looking at the delta, the difference between where you are and how widespread a problem if it is. And so if it turns out, based upon your analysis, that you don't really have severe problems and the extent of the problem only goes to one or two individuals, you may need to be changing just things a little bit. Unfortunately, what probably is going to be occurring in these scenarios is that you're going to be having a high severe problem that covers most of your organization. And in that particular case, that's where whole-scale change is going to need to occur if you wish to survive and if you wish to take advantage of the opportunities that come out for the scenario. Given these kind of circumstances here, we've categorized the type of changes that what an organization might go through. And that is what we call level 1, 2, 3, and 4 type changes. Level 4 type changes are those things that require only, back up. Level 4 type changes are only those kind of things that require modest kind of changes. Level 3 changes may be more whole, systemic kind of changes inside your organization. And level 1 and 2 kind of changes involve scenario planning and major strategic realignment in terms of what needs to be done. To give an example in terms of the different techniques that are involved in this, is that level 1 is what we call changing and anticipating the future. That is using scenarios to substantially change in terms of what your organization is going to be doing. Level 2, which most people would normally call strategic planning, and that is where you define and refine your mission and core competencies. Level 3 is the fundamental change of business processes, such as putting in a new ERP system, fundamentally restructuring the organization, buying and selling businesses, and the like. And level 4 are those things that incrementally change existing business processes. That is, those things that actually are designed to improve and make more efficient what you are already doing. And we're not going to have big time to going over this, but this is our model to be dealing with these kind of situations and how to be integrating scenario planning, strategic planning, and major fundamental change in here. I would encourage you to be going to our website and to our YouTube channel, and you certainly will be getting more detail in regards to this, because this is obviously a set for a whole workshop simply just by itself. But just to briefly summarize, is that you need to be asking things for framework questions, and that is where you do your initial analysis. You need to be choosing what kind of techniques you're going to be using, then develop your goals, your strategies and methods, your measurement system, and then to plan to implement the organizational change. As you can see, sometimes this gets a little bit complicated. And so what we have done is we have developed collaboration software that can be done remotely, not ideally remotely, but can be done remotely. It's called Consensus Builder. And using this particular kind of collaboration software, it helps organizations and senior management actually go through this particular kind of process.